Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today, we're going to be talking about the new albums by Aurora called Infections of a Different Kind and a Different Kind of Human. So I've talked a little bit about backlash that I've received for certain reviews. I don't tend to bring it up that much because honestly, it doesn't faze me that much anymore. But there are certain cases where I'm a little bit bewildered at the intensity of the anger and vitriol I get. Mostly because it comes most on reviews when I'm more mixed on the project than outright negative. And 2016 was a year where I had more of those episodes than most. But what I thought threw me off the most starkly was the response I got covering the Norwegian indie pop artist Aurora. Now, I'll admit I wasn't really kind to her debut, but the truth was that I was more ambivalent to mixed on it as a whole. It wasn't really bad, but it also wasn't that distinctive or memorable either. A well-trod indie pop lane that frankly has only felt all the more oversaturated in recent years. The comparisons that I originally made were to Christina Perri and Elvira, but going back to All My Demons Greet Me as a Friend now, it becomes abundantly clear I should have made the parallel to Florence and the Machine, just swapping out some of the chamber pop for lilting, slightly gothic folk indie pop that played on creepy girl weirdness in a way that nowadays in 2019 feels depressingly conventional, or at the very least overplayed. So I'll admit I was in no hurry to hear more from Aurora, and indeed I skipped over her 2018 project Infections of a Different Kind, especially with the expectation that it was part 1 to a full album part 2 dropping this year, which is why I'm covering both of them here. And I figured I would go in cold. After all, Florence and the Machine has only grown on me considerably in the past couple of years, and I had to hope that all the Bjork poses that Aurora was making would wind up translating to slightly more interesting music. So alright, what do we get on both Infections of a Different Kind and A Different Kind of Human? Well, I'm actually quite glad that I chose to cover these two albums together, mostly because the broad points I would make about one feel just as relevant to the other. And for the most part, they reflect how I'm still not quite sold on Aurora just yet. And again, it's hard to avoid that many of my issues with her circle back to a blur of sonic affectations that just don't quite feel as original as you would expect surrounding an otherwise conventional indie pop sound, production, and structure. And while I would argue there are a few better songs here on aggregate in comparison with the debut, it is an improvement. I'm also left with a consistent nagging feeling that if Aurora had streamlined this double release into a single album chock full of the best, at the very least it would give us a simpler, more straightforward act like Sigrid, a run for her money instead of staying pretty close or even slipping behind. In other words, while I might enjoy these two projects a fair bit more than All My Demons Greet Me as a Friend, I would struggle to call this great instead of merely just pretty good. It is still pretty good, it's definitely enjoyable, the fans will love it, but I'm still not quite sold yet. But let's start with Aurora herself. And you know what, as much as I will give her credit for expanding her vocal range and her presence behind the microphone, it's hard to avoid the feeling that her marketing and promotion might be setting up some oversold expectations. And thus, while the album art or the presentation might prompt a little bit of a Bjork parallel, it's a little bit unfair to the more immediate and slightly more straightforward style of writing that Aurora puts forward and a lot of her delivery. But that also doesn't escape the parallels that can be made towards Elvira or Florence Welch or even of Monsters and Men on the first disc, and with some of the more electronic vocal filters, especially toward Imogen Heap or early Sia on the second, especially when her actual vocal timbre isn't that far removed from the husky delivery that is so common with women in indie pop today. And while I mentioned Sigrid before, look, the lilting cadence, how Aurora approaches the more bombastic multi-tracking, there are a lot of parallels on the more conventionally structured songs, even if you could argue that Aurora is the darker, more alien and feral mirror image, although it raises an interesting question in how that is being framed. Considering so much of her chanted, mantra-esque multi-tracking, it's rooted in tones that owe more to world music rather than any one lane in indie pop. Yes, she says that she's inventing languages that only she can understand, but it's not like Elvira didn't do that as well 4 years ago. It's often done as a shortcut to disguise how nothing's really being said with those words, and it also doesn't disguise where the roots of such cadences and language structures lie. I'm just pointing it out, I'm not criticizing it. And if you're asking why I'm bringing up so many other comparisons here, well, that's where those expectations come through yet again. Because if Aurora is being positioned or promoted as so unique and distinctive within her scene and lane, or even that she's in her own lane altogether, it's a little bit jarring that it's so easy for me to draw some of those parallels and not be wowed by what she's delivering. She's not that far ahead of the pack, especially when you consider a lot of her production and lyrical style. And you know what? Let's focus on the writing first, because this is where Aurora has gotten the most traction with her fans and assertions of otherworldly scenes and symbolism, spanning from the more feral references to the environment or spiritualism on the first disc to slightly more futuristic and sci-fi iconography on the second. But you know what? If you start digging even a little into the subtext or any attempts at themes on this project, it's hard to avoid the feeling that a lot of this iconography can really only be taken at surface value. Where the shifting genres of metaphor, they feel like lyrical cosplay to add superficial flavor but not a lot of depth, with Aurora being the chameleon at the core, wearing a lot of different hats. And when the veneers they drop away to the more conventional metropolitan reference points on the first half of the second disc, well, you're faced with the question of how layered her writing really gets. On the first disc, the arc seems to be confronting that darker, unstable world and potentially a relationship around her, which forces her to dig into her vulnerability and find a deeper core of strength in order to persist, be stronger, be it love or a world so racked with pain that she craves some higher power and to help alleviate herself. And by the second disc, the focus on letting those reinforced emotions fly free into the larger world, and how we should aim to dream bigger and look outside petty modern concerns. Because eventually, if you are so chosen, you'll be taken away from whatever this collapsing world to whatever might come next, come after. And yet, you know what? The more I think about this arc, the more it feels kind of undercooked and frequently disconnected. For as much as Infections of a Different Kind is all about finding your inner core of strength and vulnerability in a dark world or potentially in a bad relationship, how does that really match with Queendom as the opener, which is basically your standard pop empowerment anthem in a more feminist package? I mean, you'd think this would be your closer to get to that point, because going darker after that song implies a subversion. And then when you go to A Different Kind of Human, you know what? I don't see a problem with the whole transcending humanity arc, or even that the primary metaphor is an alien encounter. But the too good for this world, I must detach kind of flies in the face of how many of her bigger songs emphasize community, trying to make this world better. They might start in the same place as self-actualization, being able to get better for yourself so you can help others, but the final message gets kind of contradictory and muddy, not helped by placing Apple Tree and the Seed right after the title track with that alien iconography, and then right before all the callbacks and reprise on Mothership. And you know what? You can say, look, Mark, well, these are pop songs. Aurora herself has admitted the second album is more scattered. You're paying way too much attention to the sequencing, and besides, you should be satisfied with the layer of more distinctive writing you get here. It is a cut above a lot of pop. And yet, I've got three major retorts to this. Number one, Aurora and her team has always tried to promote her materials having greater depth, so I'm gonna look for it. Number two, for relying so heavily on emotional depth that can't be contextualized in words, a lot of the writing and delivery feels pretty straightforward and otherwise pretty direct, especially when the reinforcement of all the multi-tracking floods in to emphasize that point. And building off that for number three, it's not like the production or sound is implying added depth for her either beyond servicing the main metaphor. Going back to Sigrid, I gave her a lot of credit for leaning on some straightforward primary color emotionality, but the writing at least implied some deeper level of distinctive humanity and maturity. Whereas for Aurora, there's a childlike simplicity to the framing of the writing where the emotional depth doesn't really always translate. And let me make this clear. This sort of framing, it can absolutely work just as well when the songs are more melodically distinct and the writing leans into the metaphors. Queendom, it feels heavy-handed, kind of clunky in the layering and poorly placed on the album, but the twinkle, the deeper organic elements and the fluttery keys against the pulsating scratch of the beat and piano foundation of Forgotten Love, following right after that, it's one of the best songs here. A similar formula that pays off in spades for the gentle burbling of the river, with the brighter Churches as synths, or the galloping swing groove on Daydreamer. But then you actually have the achingly sad harps and cellos on It Happened Quiet, the creeping gothic knock of Churchyard with the darker strings, the ghostly multitracking, and that sharper rattling knock of percussion. Or you know what, even some of the fizzy alien touches and some beautiful multitracking around the spare synthetic touches of a different kind of human. It's just ethereal enough to really work, which is no surprise why they then interpolated it for the reprise on Mothership. It's a beautiful moment to close out the album. And yet, no, while we're not really getting a lot of instrumental melody driving these songs, the tracks that I highlighted, they probably feel the most developed either there or in the vocal harmonies. And while the multitracking is pretty persistent, it does get a bit exasperating when most of the album doesn't quite have the same eccentricity like on a song like Animal, or it just doesn't connect as powerfully as it could. Think of a song like Gentle Earthquakes, with all its shuddering, grainy electronics and low-end rumble, or the subtle stutter and the washed-out keys behind Dance on the Moon. Can you imagine just how potent either of these songs would otherwise be with a more prominent tune to anchor it outside of the vocal multitracking? Or take songs like All Is Soft Inside with the ponderous strings and the darker keys, or the piano-driven atmospherics of the closing song Infections of a Different Kind on the first disc. Imagine how potent those songs could be if a hook or a potent climax point actually resolved coming out of them. And then when you got songs like Hunger, where the backing squawk of the tune just does nothing, or how hollow and tinny the percussion and vocal pickup sound on Apple Tree, or how the breathy shudder of In Bottles can sound even more washed out, especially in the vocals. I mean, many fans have highlighted how the second disc is a little bit weaker overall than the first, and I gotta say it, they aren't really wrong with that, and they are the missteps and kind of dead spots on the album. Not precisely bad, but not really good either. But to summarize all this, look, you know what? I feel like this is an improvement from Aurora in simply bringing together a few better songs overall in comparison with her debut. But they are sprayed across two projects that are more diffuse and underwhelming than they should be, especially when the layers start to feel increasingly thin the more you dig into them. And when I hear that Aurora wrote hundreds of songs in preparations for this release and then just chose the ones here, I kind of left with a similar feeling to when I covered the last Carly Rae Jepsen album. If she had dug down and refined her style and the cuts we got even more, trim this down to a single album, which in patches I would argue Aurora could do here, we could have gotten a genuinely great project. But as it is, I'm still not quite as enamored in Aurora's image and sound and production as a lot of people are in indie pop, but I am willing to give these two as a whole a light 7 out of 10. First disc is a solid 7, second is a strong 6. It averages out. And while I don't see the best moments here shining quite as starkly as the truly great pop I've heard this year, it is an improvement. I will call that out. So yeah, if you're curious and you think you're gonna dig the aesthetic a little bit more than I do, and I know there's a whole fan base who will really get on that, you know what? Give it a chance. Pretty good stuff if you're willing to sit through it. Check it out. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. I know this is a little bit longer, but hey, I'm covering 2 albums at once here. I figured I'd knock them both off, and if you're curious to check this out, it's worth it. Links to stream and buy in the description down there. And I got the poll up there for all the diehard fans telling me how wrong I am. Looking forward to it. Beyond that, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. And hey, if you guys actually are looking for Billboard Breakdown, the link is right over there. Plus all social media is in the description down below. You guys all know the drill. But till then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.